I tried using co-op video games as a language teaching tool for students who want to learn English. I didn't charge anything for it, it was a free service I was offering to see if it could work as a business model basically. But it turned out to be much more for the sake of science research. Now, let me back up a bit first. A long time ago, I realized that video games are an amazing tool for language learning. I would frequently play video games in Russian like The Witcher 3 or Skyrim and a whole host of other games. I would even sometimes stop the game just to translate a word. That certainly helped me quite a lot. Much more fun than reading a book if you ask me. What you can't do in those video games, or any single player game for that matter, is to talk. So I figured I can do lessons where I would add that element. It would be just like a conversation practice while playing video games. Since I didn't want to deal with technical issues by doing it online, I just bought 2 gaming laptops straight away and pre-installed ArmA 3, a military simulation game. It gave me plenty of tools to build my own missions and fashion the lesson however I wanted. This game can be technically cumbersome, but you walk with a keyboard and turn around with a mouse, so how difficult can it be? I listed myself in an English teaching website and waited. Now, the word free was enough to get me plenty of calls. My phone didn't stop ringing, and in no time I had a bunch of volunteers. The first mission I built was an anti-terrorism mission. There was some shooting target practices, some driving around, and some neat explosions. The first volunteer was a young Russian man. His English was very bad. Too bad. It was hard to talk to him without having to explain myself in his native language. I felt he was a bad candidate for that. There are 3 orange balloons.
Three orange balloons.
Yeah, I didn't say shoot at them. I didn't say shoot. You shot them. You're not listening to my instructions. He did at least have some video games orientation, which helped with the technical difficulties, but I felt he was taking it more as a joke. He was just having fun. Well, that's part of the concept, to have fun. I felt like all his energy and enthusiasm went towards having fun and not for learning English. There should be a balance here. Make no mistake about it. I literally had to remind him that he should focus on speaking English and not speak to me in Russian. Попробуй не говорить на русском.
Не говорить на русском, хорошо.
Я знаю, что это тяжело для
Это
тебя,
тяжело.
It wasn't a good start, and I felt like I needed a candidate who spoke slightly better English and not a complete beginner. In the second mission, I decided that I should add myself as a player. I built an alien invasion mission, and the player would have to talk to this professor character played by me. Now, I didn't actually flesh out the story, and I figured I would just improvise a lot. It was just too damn perfect because the second volunteer was a 50 years old Orthodox Jew who never played video games before. It was as disastrous as you can imagine. He couldn't figure out walking and looking around. His English was slightly better than the previous candidate, which helped, but the technical difficulties were just too overwhelming. He just couldn't grasp the concept that you need to use both a keyboard and a mouse to move and look around. No matter how much I tried to explain it to him, we couldn't get through a minute without stopping for a technical issue, mostly having to do with his orientation in 3D space. Plus, I felt he didn't really appreciate the aliens plot. At the end of the session, it was clear to us both it wasn't gonna work. I felt like I had gone off the deep end, frankly, and had a lot of doubts at this point. But I was just at the beginning, so I had to keep going, and I had to keep trying. I decided to make it a bit more constructed and scripted. I wrote down a scenario describing my role as a male character living on an island, a desert island, and the player playing an American rescue worker. I even wrote down a page of instructions for the player to read before playing to understand what's going on and what he should be doing. So his mission was actually to rescue that male character I was playing and to get him to the helicopter. So for that mission, the candidate I got was a 44 years old man with a good conversational English. I didn't expect his level of English to be this good. He easily sorted out through the English level that I had planned for. Who are you?
I am from the United States. I am a surgeon from the United States Army.
The only thing I could have done is to correct his grammar, but I didn't want to get bogged down with grammar. I was just too impressed by him compared to the first two. The second problem is that I had finished the session in less than 15 minutes. There was nothing else to do with the rest of the time. I didn't have anything else planned. And when I asked him for criticism, he said the following: "It would be cooler with VR, and it would be cooler if there was a woman in the game like me." Now, I didn't go with the VR idea. I thought it was a bit too far-fetched at this point, particularly. But I did go with the woman in the game idea. I thought that would be a nice addition. And I got where he's coming from, especially when my players are male, my students rather. So I figured, hey, why not? Maybe it would add another level of interest to the game. For the fourth mission, I actually brought my dad. My dad always wants to improve his English, so I made a typical anti-terrorism mission. This time I added some flashy moments. I also added myself as a character.
Okay.
Okay, follow me.
Follow me.
Now, my dad, having never played video games before, there was a huge learning curve. It also felt he was a bit distracted by the killing of terrorists as opposed to learning English.
What will leave It's
Leave
here.
him, he ran away, leave him. But overall, it felt pretty decent. When I asked him what he felt about it, he just said it was okay. He didn't seem to take it as seriously as I do, and didn't even ask me about another session. For the fifth mission, I did something completely different. I decided to avoid action-packed plots and not overcomplicate it for myself. So I started with a clean slate. I made a sort of tutorial location, and once again I added myself as a character. I also added another rules to the students, that they must always speak English. Always. If they wanted to explain themselves, they must do it in English. So it was tricky, but I felt like it was necessary to get them to exercise themselves. So the fifth candidate who came along, or rather guinea pig, as I would occasionally call them, was a 20 years old man. He also had bad English, like the first candidate, and had never played video games before. So the odds were playing against me here. But my goal was as basic as it can be, to teach him how to walk and to use very basic English. At first there were a lot of struggles and awkwardness. He couldn't figure out movements. But just as I was losing hope, he seemed to have gotten the hang of it, and it ended up being my first truly successful mission. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Now crouch. No, you're crawling. You're crawling. Crouch. X. X. Okay, good. Okay. Now crawl. Okay, good job. You can get up. You can get up. Well done. After the session, he wrote back to me that it helped him a lot, and I was rather encouraged by it. Finally, my first success. The sixth student was interesting. He actually wanted to study Hebrew, which is also something that I advertised for. So the sixth mission was about volunteering in the Israeli army. Ironically, that's something my candidate claimed to have done in the past. He was also quite young, late 20s or early 30s, and he had played ArmA 3 before, so it had all the potential of being very successful. And it certainly was. There were hardly any technical issues. Things went quite smoothly. There were some bugs which he laughed at. Not everything I do worked according to plan. There were a lot of improvisations all around, and I found it easier to do with him. Only problem was that I had spent a lot of time building the mission. All this pre-planning was exhausting and starting to take its toll. Sure, I could have reused missions, but I wanted to do something new every time, or it would have become boring to me. Since I was so exhausted with planning missions, I decided to try a game where I wouldn't have to do that. So Fallout 76 seemed like just a game for that. Plenty of missions to go all around, random events, lots of stuff in the environment, so I felt pretty confident about my choice, even though I never played Fallout 76 before. So, the seventh candidate was another young Russian man who had pretty decent English. At first I was worried we're gonna lose ourselves with all the fighting, because this game has a lot of enemies, lots of fighting, but we didn't lose ourselves. We had some pretty nice interaction.
Going back from that way we come.
Oh, we're going back where we came from? Okay, sure. It's getting to be pretty dark.
Yes. You're afraid of dark?
A little bit, there are monsters, so I don't want to be around monsters when it's dark. Next time that you don't know a word,
Mm-hmm.
you can try to look in the dictionary or a Google Translate.
Okay.
Just find the word.
Okay.
Can you tell me what's the name of this? You know how this is called?
Table? No?
Yeah, it's a table.
Oh, okay.
Problem is that we had to ignore the stories because the characters in the game which promote the storylines speak too fast or too long, and there were lots of notes and text to read as well. I just couldn't strike the right balance between wanting to listen and understand the story and perhaps then translating it to him and just having spontaneous fun. It didn't help when I felt like he was losing his patience during those long reads. It would have at least helped if I was more experienced with the game, but I wasn't. I was practically as new as him to Fallout 76. But all in all, the person still seemed to have enjoyed the session. He was somewhat coming on to me, and I was rather hoping that wasn't the reason he enjoyed himself. Where do you think we should go?
It's very interesting, but I didn't play for a long time.
Play? No, we're not playing. This is real life. We're not playing. This is real life.
But in real life, you look very good.
Yeah. I don't understand whether you mean in the game or in real life, but okay.
No, I mean in a game the hero look good, but you look very good.
Oh, thank you. She has a scar. You see, she has a scar
Yes.
across her eye. You see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. For the first time, I made a second session with someone, that same person who went through my bootcamp. Well, this time I decided to make it a bit more interesting with more things to look at and more things happening. I added a storyline and the player had to drive around. He told me he enjoyed it a lot and that it helps him a lot. I started to feel pretty good about myself at this point, or pretty good about my idea rather. Straightforward. Oops. Okay, that's okay. Avoid the trees. I will write it down. Avoid the trees. Avoid the trees. Don't run into the trees.
Okay.
Okay, good. You see the light? You see there is light over there?
Right.
Over there is light. Yes, there is light. Wait, I will write it down. There is light.
Okay.
Do you see the light?
Yeah.
Drive towards the light. Drive towards the light.
Okay.
Drive towards the light. Good. Good job. You're almost inside again. Okay, slow down. Oh, jeez. Okay, you're inside. Stop. You're inside. Good job. Press V to get out of the vehicle.
So.
Well done. Okay, you got us back to safety and you saluted to the captain. The mission is over. Well done. For the person learning Hebrew, well, he also had a second session and I decided to make him like a border officer. He would decide who is allowed to go in and who isn't, and his goal was to distinguish the terrorists from the civilians. So it was again something different because there was a lot of role playing involved. And we had a bunch of fun actually. I was making voices and accents and it was overall a very successful session. אני בהפסקה, אני לא צריך את החרא הזה, אתה תתמודד לבד, אני באמת אין לי כבר כוח לזה, עשיתי את זה 6 שעות ולא בא לי להמשיך לעשות את זה יותר, בסדר? אז אתה עכשיו לבד ואל תקשיב למה שהיא אמרה.
רות.
Again, the only persistent problem was that I was investing an enormous amount of time doing all the planning. When the same guy, the 20-year-old, came for a third session, I was so exhausted that I ended up not doing a good enough of a job, not thinking through enough and trying to rush through the planning process, so the whole mission felt awkward. Even my improvisations weren't too successful. There's another thing that I didn't mention. Since I live alone, some of the people who came to my apartment were coming on to me, and I didn't appreciate that. Since I live in a small apartment and my bed was basically in the same room that we were studying, I always felt discomfort about that. And I was sitting behind the player, since I really had nowhere else to sit. So that felt awkward as well. I thought about renting a teaching place, but the costs were too much. There was a great deal of comfort doing it in my apartment. I stopped because, well, teaching with video games is a messy trade. It's certainly very likely to be too messy for the person you're just gonna pick up off the street. So the idea is that it's good for people who find it boring to just have a conversation practice where they talk about themselves and want to have some sort of virtual story to experience their target language. You know, some action-packed story with immersive qualities. But who knows? Maybe most people just prefer to have a conversation and not have this virtual experience. So, did I improve their English? Hell if I know. It's hard to gauge how much I helped a person to improve their language skills because I just didn't do it for a long enough period of time. But I did get some positive feedback, so there is that. Now, since my volunteer students had very different personality, it was easy to tell who it works better for and who it doesn't work at all for. If the player isn't proactive and creative enough and the burden is on me, it becomes difficult because I feel like I need to give too many instructions And instead of something that goes both ways, it feels like the person is just following my instructions. Follow me, do this, take this, etc. It gets boring over time. But when the player also initiates conversations as well, it makes it easier on me, and the dialogue can be far more extensive and interesting. At the end of the day, they do get conversation practice out of it, and that's all that matters. Now, another big issue that was more frustrating than I originally thought it would be was the technical difficulties. I had to explain the controls over and over again. This leads me to my main and ultimate conclusion that in order to manage a concept like that, it should be done by a company that will create a game specifically for that. And that would make the whole process of not only technical difficulties a lot easier, but the whole system a lot easier. And then the audience would be online, so people could do it from the comfort of their own homes. And that would probably attract more players that have video games orientation to begin with. I do think that's the future of learning languages, through virtual realities. And I do believe that we're slowly approaching there. I believe a game like that is bound to come along sooner or later. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.